You know him as the ultimate cinematic villain, the burdened, tragic savior of the MCU who sacrificed everything to bring balance to a starving universe. But what if I told you that the original Thanos didn't give a damn about saving the universe, didn't care about resources or balance? That beneath that terrifying armor, that godlike power, is a history of insecurity, self-sabotage, and an obsessive, one-sided romance? From his chilling origins as Marvel's most vile murderer, to sitting on a throne made of Avengers' skulls, to literally defeating the very gods of the Marvel Universe themselves. The history of Thanos is long, violent, and deeply lonely, and I'm going to try my best to take you through all of it. The history of the character. Thanos' origins can be traced back to the 1970s, specifically the work of Jim Starlin and co-creator Mike Friedrich. Making his first debut in 1973's Invincible Iron Man number 55, the Mad Titan has since become one of the most defining and popular characters ever to come out of Marvel. As I write this, it's kind of making me realize that it's poetic how one of his most iconic moments ever has to do with Iron Man 2.
And I am Iron Man.
The actual concept for Thanos came from a strange place, Starlin's college psychology class, just a while after he had completed his military service. The lectures, specifically those around Freudian psychoanalytic theory and the divide between Eros, which was the side of creation, and Thanatos, which was the side of entropy, were the inspirations behind Thanos and his brother Eros. These concepts were brought to life in the two brothers, who were the complete antithesis of each other. Eros was a messier character than Thanos, far more human than his brother, who was, ironically enough, always obsessed with Mistress Death, which is a facet of his character that we're going to get into later. That's the thematic skeleton of the character. Now, with a guy like Thanos, big buff purple alien enforcing his will on all living things, you might think his roots lie in the timeless character of DC's Darkseid. Hell, I thought it too. In our Marvel and DC copycat video, I made the comparison between both characters, and whether or not it's unintentional, there are some strong parallels. But you would actually be surprised. It wasn't Darkseid. It was another New Gods character that paved the way for the very first sketches of the Mad Titan, and that was Metatron. Jim was always a huge fan of Kirby's New Gods and took massive inspirations from Kirby's work. Now, his editor, Roy Thomas, was actually more responsible for bringing his design much closer to the intimidating look of Darkseid, and I have to hand it to him, it was a solid idea. In terms of these basic elements of the character, excluding the whole high school crush over the cosmic entity of death aspect, the MCU and the comics aren't very far apart, but they do diverge a lot more frequently than they align. In the comics, Thanos was born to the Eternals, a Lars and Suisan, but he carried the Deviant gene, which mutated his physical appearance. That's the in-universe logic behind his signature purple, crinkly skin and his gigantic frame. The MCU has kinda kept this concept too, since we know for sure that Eros is an Eternal and the brother of Thanos, which does make Thanos an Eternal as well, but it has never once gone into either of the two's lineage, family history, or any potential deviant gene in Thanos. I'm also still not really sure how I feel about Harry Styles as Eros, but that's a video for another day. Now, we're going to go into the history of the character throughout the movies, so if you're already familiar with this, just skip ahead. But anyway, Thanos was born on the planet Titan, which at some point became pretty overpopulated. There were simply not enough resources to sustain Titan's massive population, and so Thanos had the genius idea to kill half of everybody. You can expect what happens next, and it ends with Thanos being ostracized, even though he was right. Eventually, scarcity did claim Titan, and what seemed like a once beautiful planet was reduced to nothing. This sparked Thanos' journey to carry out his master plan for Titan across the entire universe. So he went across the universe, wiping out half the population on each planet that was unlucky enough to be in his vicinity. He forged many alliances with people like the Other and Ronan the Accuser, and even adopted orphan children from the many planets destroyed, including his adoptive daughters, Gamora and Nebula. He also had a nice little hobby known as experimenting on my foster daughter until she became an antisocial assassin. He always had a soft spot for Gamora though. Now, it's never really shown how or why he learned about the Infinity Stones, but at some point, he became aware of their power and decided to obtain them. He realized it was the quickest way to his balanced utopia. First, he gets the Mind Stone, which he places in a scepter and gives to the Asgardian god Loki after allying with him. Loki, with the scepter and a Chitauri army in his arsenal, decide to invade Earth and obtain the Space Stone, housed in the Tesseract. He fails miserably at this, which doesn't really please Thanos. Somewhere along the way, he also finds the location of the Power Stone and sends Ronan, Gamora, and Nebula on a mission to acquire it. They also fail miserably at this. Gamora betrays him, Ronan obtains the stone and decides to kill Thanos, and Nebula allies with Ronan. Maybe if you didn't go all Dr. Giro on your daughter, she'd have a bit more loyalty. At this point, Thanos is pretty done. Knowing that he needs a weapon that can use the awesome power of the stones, he goes to Nidavellir, home of the universe's best dwarven smiths, and kills all of them except for Eitri, forcing him to make the Infinity Gauntlet. He then starts collecting the stones by one. He totally decimates Sandar for the Power Stone, kill half the Asgardian refugees and Loki for the Tesseract, gets the Reality Stone from the Collector, kills his own daughter for the Soul Stone, hands the Avengers their own asses on Titan for the Time Stone, and finally brutally defeats the forces of Earth, traumatizing Wanda Maximoff in the process, and gets the Mind Stone. But hey, at least he cried when he killed Gamora. With everything he needs literally in hand, he does exactly what he said he would do and wipes out half of all life in the universe. He then disappears and teleports to the garden where he just sits, I guess. I don't actually know how someone is supposed to feel after that, but he doesn't get to do that for a very long time either. 23 days later, the Avengers ambush him and kill him, but not before they find out about his final screw you. He used the power of the stones to destroy the stones. The mind of the Mad Titan. I'm pretty sure everyone who's going to click this video is familiar with his run in the movies, but what you might not know is how much they changed his character. The Thanos that we've seen in the comics is a completely different personality, and depending on the writer, he can be one of the most dangerous schemers, a deep philosopher, an absolute tyrant, or even an anti-hero. But it's really hard to talk about Thanos and his entire history as a character without first addressing the biggest gap between the MCU and the comics, his actual core motivation. You see, in Starlin's original stories, particularly 1991's Infinity Gauntlet, Thanos is a complete nihilist. His entire drive as a being comes from his obsessive romance with death. In the comics, his story also starts with the snap, rather than ending with it. Plus, there were dozens of heroes killed in the snap that never made it to the movies. The entire thing, from assembling the Infinity Gems to fighting the Avengers to wielding the Gauntlet, was all one huge long romantic gesture. The mad part of his nickname comes from him being Marvel's biggest simp, not because he'd kill trillions of people. That's just a typical Marvel villain for you. When he does successfully assemble the Gauntlet though, it's a lot like the movies. The snap is nearly immediate, but right after that, he kinda goes to Mistress Death expecting her to be head over skeleton heels for him, but she really isn't impressed. And I mean, she literally doesn't care at all. And naturally, Thanos, being absolutely insane, did not take this too well. But he didn't try to use his infinite power on his beloved Death. No, he did something far more unpredictable. Thanos actually tried to make Goddess Death jealous, and the way he did it is still an all-time classic piece of comic trivia for me. Instead of using the Reality Stone to make her jealous, or by using the Mind Stone to read her thoughts and discover what would do the trick, he created a girlfriend for himself, for no other purpose than to make Death jealous. This might seem like a joke, but it's also one of the things that I really want to dissect here. You see, this is one of the biggest differences between comic Thanos and movie Thanos. In the movies, Thanos is portrayed as the wise, burdened, tragic martyr, and the writers went to great lengths to portray him that way. They want you to think that this is some troubled soul who understands the preciousness of a single resource, because that's what happened to him. He came from a planet that was ravaged by scarcity. But in the comics, Thanos couldn't be more different. For all intents and purposes, he's just a kid throwing a tantrum. Physically, he is terrifying. One look at him and you can tell that this guy is the final boss of something. But in his heart, he's a man ruled by impulses and all-consuming emotions. He couldn't stand that after doing everything he possibly imagined, Death still wouldn't even smile his way, let alone agree to coffee in outer space. And if he couldn't have what he wanted, then he needed to show the object of his desire, how nonchalant he is, how little he cares at all. At least that's what he thought Taraxia would do. But Death didn't care at all. The reason I say that he's very childish at heart is that it's only a kid who can't be upfront about their real feelings, instead of choosing to try every roundabout way imaginable to avoid whatever those feelings might mean. And Thanos has some really roundabout ways. For example, when he realized that even, a factory-made alien mommy wasn't enough to deal with being rejected, he decided to make a show of how brave and strong he is. Mephisto literally conned this dude into weakening himself by using his own biggest wish against him, impressing Death. Let that sink in for a second. In the 90s, in this run, Jim's Infinity Gauntlet, he was written to be a total nihilist, and that's why he can't see past his desire for death, to the point that he intentionally gave himself a chance to lose just so Death could look at him and think, wow, what a stud. Deep down, there's also a huge need for validation here. Despite becoming one of the most powerful beings in the multiverse, it's not enough. He needs someone else's approval and admiration to feel like he did something. Compare that to the self-assured, composed, delusional man you see in the movies. The one who says he is inevitable, the one who doesn't need anyone else's approval. In fact, he was literally rejected by his entire society and called a madman for suggesting his plan.
They called me a madman, and what I predicted came to pass.
And he still doubled down on it, carrying it out entirely on his own. By the way, that whole line about him being inevitable is a comic reference too, which comes from this panel, I think. You'll also see Cap, Thor, and Iron Man being owned by Thanos here, so that's another thing that both mediums are on the same page about. What they do differ on is the sheer scope of the forces against Thanos though, because in the comics, the big dogs showed up. Now that we have the core of Thanos' character out of the way, let's get into how that character was handled in the movies. The MCU's Thanos. I feel like I needed to show you guys the core of who Thanos really is because I feel like this run, 1991's Infinity Gauntlet, really does that. It shows him at both his absolute peak and his absolute worst, having attained everything he thinks he needs and realizing that he can't have the one thing that he wants. When everything is in the palm of his hands, the size of the void in his heart becomes all too clear. But, for better or for worse, this is also something that I feel like only the comics could have done. The movies and the Russo brothers particularly made him far more sympathizable and easier to understand, and I think it worked for them. But what surprised me was that Joss Whedon actually had no grand plans or multi-movie narrative for Thanos. I know, right? The MCU is known for its overarching story, but the core of that, the awesome antagonist, was more or less a series of whims. Whedon very publicly admitted how difficult it was for him to translate a character whose motivations were an obsessive romance with a cosmic deity, and over the years, the character went through a number of changes, including different actors. The first person to play Thanos in the MCU was Damien Poitier in the post-credits scene of the first Avengers. You know, the one with his killer line,
To challenge them is to court death.
I'm 90% sure that was a comic reference. Poitier didn't even really know that he was playing Thanos. He initially thought he was playing Kalert, the Super Skrull, because of the character profile he had received. They got away with that because until Guardians of the Galaxy, Thanos wasn't really too integral to the plot. Thanos was actually a headache for almost everyone who worked on him. Even James Gunn, and that guy's really good at superhero movies. A huge part of that was because there was no giant plan for Thanos, and because he wouldn't be a main villain until several movies later. But to make those movies work, you had to build him up little by little in every other movie. When it did come time to give Thanos the spotlight, they needed an actor who could really carry the intensity of the character. Kevin Feige went back and forth on several names like Tom Waits, Ron Perlman, and Benicio del Toro, who was ultimately cast as the Collector, until they finally decided on Josh Brolin. He had the exact presence that they wanted for somebody like Thanos, and Brolin himself was very drawn to the role. Despite normally turning down big blockbusters, for Josh, the idea of playing this insurmountable villain who goes up against the entire Avengers was too tempting because, well, it is. Who would say no to that? You're being asked to play the LeBron James of comic book villains. Brolin was given a big Bible of Thanos' arc and character to work with, and the rest is, as they say, history. Getting the actor down was just the tip of the iceberg though. There was still the gigantic challenge of taking Thanos' comic history, the Infinity Gauntlet, his legendary battles against the Avengers and the forces of the universe, the snap, and his insane motivations, and translating that into something that could touch live-action greatness. It wasn't enough to just have a good villain. To serve as the ultimate threat to the Avengers, he needed to rise far above the standard the MCU had already set with phases 1 and 2. Anthony and Joe Russo helped Brolin out a lot here, drawing inspiration from gritty, character-driven 1970s cinema like Dog Day Afternoon and Scarface. The idea was to help Brolin find a calm and resolved emotional core for the character, but while Brolin brought the vision to life, the actual character that we've come to fall in love with can be credited to 4 people. There's the Russo brothers, and then there's Joe and Christopher Marcus and Stephen McFeely. I covered a lot of this in our video, Why Thanos Didn't Just Double Resources. But the core idea behind Thanos' character arc was treating Infinity War like his own personal hero's journey. I don't know if you guys caught this, but in that movie, it really feels like Thanos is the protagonist, and we're watching him overcome every single obstacle on his way to his goal. By the way, protagonist doesn't mean good guy, it just means main character, the one around whom the plot revolves, and I feel like that's exactly what Infinity War was. Marcus and McFeely mapped Thanos as the core character, and the movie made it seem like somewhere beneath the universal genocide, if you stripped away the sheer evil and violence of everything he was doing, he almost had a point. There's only so much food and thrice as many mouths to feed, right? That's an idea almost everyone can relate to, just without the homicidal tendencies. So you followed this looming menace throughout the start of the Infinity Saga, only catching glimpses of the menace, knowing the hype that's attached to him from stories like Infinity Gauntlet, the Thanos Quest, and the Hickman Infinity runs. And now you see him in the flesh. You know he means something big, but he has yet to show you why. For movie watchers and comic readers both, the MCU needed to sell this rendition of Thanos, and that's why I think making him the protagonist of this story was a wonderful angle, because it really gives him two things: some really necessary screen time to properly set him up, and a look at things through his perspective, which again makes us understand what this dude is all about. But how did they get there? Okay, so Infinity War was Thanos' journey. How they decide what that journey is? Well, it was really messy. I've talked a bit about how they basically had no bigger plan for Thanos, which is why the actual character building process was all over the place. McFeely and Marcus would throw around ideas all the time, refining, rewriting, and restructuring drafts upon drafts. They used it for a lot more than just Thanos, but at one point, these guys had a 50-page manifesto with all their ideas that they could use. From there, it was a process of fine-tuning, of cutting down ideas and scenes until they were giving them the answers to the all-important question: what does this do for the character? Each scene would be discussed thoroughly, organized into a structure, numbered, and sent off to Marvel Parliament, which basically was made up of executive producers like Stephen Broussard, Eric Carroll, Nate Moore, Jonathan Schwartz, Trin Tran, and Brad Winderbaum. Wait, who are these guys? Think of these guys as Marvel's office's Illuminati. Moore is the guy who produced Winter Soldier, Civil War, and Black Panther. He was largely behind the grounded political atmosphere of those films. Schwartz oversaw the Guardians trilogy, and Winderbaum helmed Ragnarok and Loki. Broussard and Carroll worked on the Spider-Man trilogy, the Ant-Man movies, and Loki. Some of your favorite Marvel projects are probably on their resume. And Trin Tran, core executive producer on Infinity War and Endgame. It was her idea to have Thanos killed off in the first 20 minutes of Endgame. So between the screenwriters, these producers, dozens of more people, and Feige, the skeleton of the movie, and more importantly, Thanos, came together. Marcus and McFeely would assign each other scenes, reconvene at the end of the week, compile their work, and go over it all over again. They even drew inspiration from shows like Fargo and Breaking Bad, particularly the decision to have a 5-year time jump. But those two decisions also left the writers with a huge question: how do we deal with two different versions of the same character? Believe it or not, this actually played in their favor. You guys must have noticed that there was a huge difference between the two versions of Thanos we saw. The one from Infinity War, he was tired. He had ended his journey, one that didn't give him any real personal pleasure. I mean, the guy was living in a rundown shack with almost nothing, even though he had the Reality Stone for a while, before he atomized them completely. But the 2014 one that we see in Endgame was a whole other animal. This guy still had that fire in him. He was arrogant, vindictive, and full of ambition. But the universe was deeply against him. You have to understand, even the 2018 Thanos saw himself as somebody who was doing the right thing no matter how hard it was to do. He was only met with extreme opposition later. This, though, was a Thanos who knew that the universe rejected his solution, just like everyone did back home on Titan. Now, besides the obvious old wounds being poked at, that's enough to dishearten a guy, even someone as crazy as Thanos. It's why he changes his goal from wiping out half of all life and balancing the universe to simply reshaping the entire universe from scratch. Unlike the 2018 version, this one doesn't have the history of the journey that Thanos went through, which shaped him. This one just saw the end result of that Thanos' journey and decided none of this was worth saving anymore. That's why you see him fight at his best. He has more armor. He has a proper weapon, a killer one. He brings his entire army even before he knows the Avengers reversed the snap. He fights with fresh purpose, but ultimately, it's not really enough, and inevitably, he lost. Thanos' comic run. 5 decades of publication history leave a lot of room for reinterpretation. Over the better part of half a century, the Mad Titan has made hundreds of appearances, which can be a bit overwhelming, naturally, which is why I'm going to focus on the writers who contributed the most, and that can really be summed up in 6 key players. You got Jim Starlin, who was responsible for the 70s and 90s, who wrote Thanos Quest and the Infinity Gauntlet, the most popular Thanos stories ever, and a few other pretty important runs, which we'll discuss in a while. Then you have Keith Giffen, who wrote the character with a lot of depth and leaned into his fundamental traits like craving knowledge, being curious, and his incredible scheming. He actually took over the character halfway through a Starlin run, 2003's Thanos issues 7 to 12. That's the mid-2000s. Past that, you got Jonathan Hickman, which is a pretty divisive run. I feel like there's a part of the fanbase that really loves what he did for the character, and a part that thinks he just reverted him back into a ruthless, army-commanding warlord with obsessive tendencies. And the same can be said about Jason Aaron, who wrote Thanos Rising, which kind of retconned a key part of his character that we'll discuss much later on when we unravel the modern Thanos. Now, Gillen's definitive Thanos work is largely considered to be the Eternal storyline, where he introduced the concept of the Great Machine, the system that constantly resurrects Eternals when they die. There's also the Eternals, the heretic one-shot, where he introduced a new addition to Thanos' family tree, Uranos the Undying, who had some pretty similar ideas to Thanos as far as wiping out millions of people went. Gillen and later on Donny Cates and Jason Aaron are largely known for bringing Thanos' more villainous side back. Over the years, the character has flip-flopped from being a nihilistic, unstable, obsessive maniac to a somber, retired warrior who reflects on the path that got him here. Like we discussed at the start, he was born to a Lars and Suisan. His grandparents, Dinah and Kronos, were also notable Eternals, especially Kronos, who was the leader of the Eternals on Earth. Meanwhile, his parents, Lars and Suisan, took it upon themselves to repopulate Titan through science. The kind of psychopathy Thanos is defined by isn't really something common for his family. Except Suisan. You see, when she saw Thanos' purple skin and deformed face, she understood that her child had deviant genes, and this drove her completely insane. Suisan had actually planned to call her second son Dione after a goddess, but when she saw him, she named him Thanos, a name derived from the Greek personification of death, and it wasn't really just her. See, before Thanos was born, Titan was kind of a utopia, with a society obsessed with moral and physical perfection. It's a bit like if a baby were born with devil horns here on Earth, he'd be, well, the devil. The first time Suisan would hold her child, she tried to kill him, only failing because Lars had stopped her. This child returned that favor 12 years later when he killed his mother. Now, see, this is what I meant by reinterpretation. If you read Jim Starlin's work, his mother is just one of the many victims of his genocide on Titan. At some point in his life, Thanos got exiled, which happened to him because he got so obsessed with death that he started practicing the dark arts and figuring out ways to kill, which is heavily frowned upon in Titan society. So frowned upon that his father exiled him for it. Starlin's Thanos. In Starlin's writing, he comes back to Titan with an armada of pirate ships and kills millions. But if you read 2013's Thanos Rising by Jason Aaron, he kills his mom for much more existential reasons. Either way though, he kills his mom. So from a young age, this guy was off the deep end. But it makes sense that he wasn't right in the head when you consider how hated he was by everyone around him. On the other hand, his brother Eros was a pretty popular guy, handsome, carefree, and well-liked, in contrast to Thanos, who was always brooding and consumed by the concept of death. I'm not going to say Thanos is some traumatized individual with a backstory, but his upbringing really didn't do him any favors. Growing up like that gives you a tendency to self-sabotage because it inherently instills a lack of self-worth inside you. And regardless of what Thanos' grand exploits might make you think, Thanos deeply lacks any sense of self-worth. Just ask yourself this. If you were in his position, having obtained every single thing the world and universe had to offer, except the admiration of the love of your life, is that something that you could deal with? And I do quite literally mean everything. I mean, he even usurped eternity. I feel like most people would be able to swallow that bitter pill, but Thanos isn't most people. He is ultimately somebody who needed death's acknowledgement. And this isn't just my personal opinion, it's also how he loses in Infinity Gauntlet. Before I continue on to his loss, you need to understand, being insecure, needing someone else to validate him, this doesn't mean Thanos is mentally weak. In fact, he is one of the strongest minds in Marvel history. Even celestial entities like Order and Chaos couldn't get him to crack. But Thanos does crack. When he sees even death standing against him, he finally does crack. And his response is completely in line with his character. He decides that emotion is the problem, despite standing next to a girlfriend he literally made out of petty frustration. This is what leads him to leave his body behind after he usurps eternity, and it also opens the way for his defeat. It allowed Nebula to steal the gauntlet off his body. The first thing she does is blast him off into space. But back on Earth, Warlock and Strange watch this happen, and they know that the only person who can stop Nebula, who is far too unstable to wield the gauntlet, is Thanos himself, because he's the one who knows it best. Strange opens a portal and pulls Thanos into Earth, and here's the part where Thanos really loses. Let's just recount all that he's gone up against so far. All of the Avengers, all of the fundamental forces and deities of the universe, and even death and eternity. But what causes Thanos to finally cave in is this one conversation, because Thanos is his own worst enemy. Having seen the depths of Thanos' soul through the Soul Gem, Adam Warlock went for the jugular and pointed out his own tendency to self-sabotage. Nebula getting the gems was entirely his own fault, and it's a pattern he keeps repeating. And this, in my opinion, is why Infinity Gauntlet is considered one of the best Thanos stories ever. It explores him in his entirety, the facade of a power-hungry nihilist who is so cunning that he actually outsmarts the biggest forces in the universe, and the self-hating, self-destructive man behind it all. After aiding the heroes and defeating Nebula, Thanos tried to gain the gauntlet back, but obviously he was stopped by literally everybody. It ended up in Adam Warlock's hands, and at this point, he knew he had totally lost, so he faked his own death to escape, but not to scheme and plot again. This time, Thanos just lived as a farmer. See, that conversation with Warlock really did a number on Thanos. It caused him to, for the first time in his life, think about something other than power. Jim Starlin used this to give Thanos a unique redemption arc. In the 1992 run, Warlock and the Infinity Watch, Adam Warlock is forced to divide the 6 Infinity Gems among trusted allies so they can never be assembled again. He gives them to heroes like Gamora and Drax, but the final gem, the Reality Gem, he secretly gives to Thanos. It's a brilliant twist. Warlock realized that Thanos, having held supreme power and willingly giving it up, was the only being in the universe who truly understood the burden of it. He was the only one who wouldn't be tempted to use it. Throughout the 90s, Thanos renounced his genocidal ways. He became this reflective, philosophical anti-hero, actually teaming up with Warlock to save the universe from cosmic threats. For a while, the Mad Titan was actually at peace. Starlin actually continued to build upon this reformed Thanos throughout the Infinity War and the Infinity Crusade, in which Thanos fully becomes an anti-hero. Throughout this run, he's actually constantly surrounded by the Infinity Gems, but he rejects that power. He even reasons with Warlock almost being the most pragmatic person in the room. But Thanos was also one of Marvel's best villains, and having him regress into his more evil side was a lot more beneficial for sales. Starlin was always deeply protective over Thanos though, so much so that he introduced the concept of Thanosi, failed genetic and mystical clones created by Thanos, spliced with the DNA of other heroes and villains. This was essentially just a narrative device to retcon the out-of-character appearances of Thanos, establishing that the true character was just a retired philosopher, and all the other instances were just failed clones. There were 5 of these: Armor, Mystic, Omega, Warrior, and X. Marvel doesn't really have their best recons. Giffen's Thanos. Other writers expanded on the evolution that Starlin had laid out for the character. In the mid-2000s, Keith Giffen wrote Thanos as a very contemplative character, wondering what would happen if chaos were left unchecked in the cosmos. A lot of Giffen's Annihilation run was exploring this side of Thanos. In this run, a classic Fantastic Four villain named Annihilus invades the universe from the negative zone, bringing with him a massive all-consuming armada called the Annihilation Wave. And what does Thanos do? He doesn't fight it. He doesn't try to conquer it for himself. Instead, he essentially takes a job as Annihilus's chief advisor. Eventually, he realizes that Annihilus actually seeks to destroy the entire universe, and that's too far, even for Thanos. Deciding to betray him, he had a plan: turn Galactus, whom he had previously defeated in this same run, yeah, that happened, against Annihilus. You see, Thanos had trapped the Planet Eater, and he also had the switch to release him, but before he could do that, he was killed by Drax the Destroyer. This actually wasn't a bad thing. Eventually, Galactus was freed thanks to Drax and Moondragon, and he did wipe out Annihilus. But more importantly, Thanos was welcomed by Mistress Death and watched on from her side, finally being united with his love. Personally, I would have preferred if he had gotten over her, but I'll take this too. Hickman's Infinity. Now, this is one of those runs where a lot of this introspective development that Thanos had was stripped away. It's a really weird run where Thanos basically invades Earth in order to kill his long-lost son, Thane, who is also an Inhuman. Also, this is a run that's meant to be read alongside New Avengers and the rest of Hickman's Avengers work, but I'm only talking about this in relation to Thanos' character, so please bear that in mind. He becomes a lot more brutal in this run, like, for example, asking Black Bolt a tribute, which is basically the head of every Inhuman teenager and young adult? That's really not something the Thanos from Annihilation and Infinity War would have done, and you're free to disagree with me, but if after constantly thinking about your past mistakes leads you to committing those same mistakes, then that's just redundant writing. I mean, this is the kind of dude he was throughout Infinity. It's your classical Thanos, the villain who thinks he can simply brute force his way through everything, the guy that uses violence to make everybody bend to his will, and the one who constantly invades planets, starts fights, and leaves death wherever he goes. Infinity ended with Thanos being defeated and trapped in an amber prison, which pretty much left him in a coma-like state where they were alive but not really. As far as Infinity goes, it was one of the best comics ever because it brought together so many factions of the Marvel Universe. You had the Avengers, the Fantastic Four, the Silver Surfer, the Skrulls, and so much more going on, all banding together again, so the scale was there. But as far as developing Thanos' character goes, this is where the fanbase gets divided. A lot of people like this version of Thanos. He is intimidating, and he has the presence of an arch nemesis to the Avengers. But a lot of people also think he was dumbed down and that Starlin's work on the character was heavily erased in order to just make him a big bad villain again. I actually think the 2014 Thanos from Endgame is the closest the MCU ever got to this modern day depiction of Thanos. They both had that same brutality, even if it's a lot more apparent in the comics. And speaking of the modern era, since we already went over Infinity, I can't really wrap this video up without discussing the other writers who shaped the Thanos of today. The modern era. The trend of reverting Thanos to his more brutal nature was something that writers like Kieron Gillen, Donny Cates, and Jason Aaron continued, but each writer had their own spin, and they didn't entirely leave the nuance behind. Take Thanos Rising, which we've mentioned a few times now. That comic actually shows you a more sentimental side of Thanos, someone who, every solar cycle, goes to Titan to visit the ruins of his home, and particularly the grave of his mother. In fact, Aaron actually portrayed young Thanos as a timid, reasonable pacifist, the kind of kid who could de-escalate rather than pick a fight. And not only that, Aaron also really tries to explore the effects that being an outcast from a young age had on Thanos. While Starlin's Thanos was a cold, calculating villain who didn't really have a tragic, fleshed-out backstory, Aaron's Thanos is someone who had developed insomnia, deeply wanted to connect with those around him, especially his mother, and always had a very aware sense of how different he was. And it wasn't even just that incident. Aaron wrote Thanos to be a deeply sensitive child. This was his reaction to simply cutting open a corpse during a science class. Also, take note of that girl next to him. She's central to this entire story. Aaron added a softer, much more human and kind-sided Thanos that simply was rare to see for the character. Despite this, the treatment from society did get to him, but it didn't exactly turn him into a psychotic nihilist. Aaron kept some core notes of the character, such as his trademark curiosity, which led him to learn things far beyond whatever his education on Titan could teach him. Now, here's where he loses me a bit. The reason Thanos was so thirsty for knowledge in Aaron's portrayal was to answer the question of who he is. What is his purpose? What I don't get too much is why he'd find those answers in the autopsies of living beings. But hey, I'm not Jason Aaron. What I do know is that these questions from a very young age haunted Thanos. Another thing Aaron maintained from previous runs is Thanos' lack of self-worth. But he's made to be a lot more tragic in this run, being starved of love. So you have this kid that seems to seek the answers to his lack of self-worth and identity through the only thing that makes him feel connected to people. Killing and connection is something he craves. Now, this is where it gets ugly. Thanos decides that the only way to answer the question of who am I is to cut up his own mother. So how did a guy like that become the Thanos we know? Well, he didn't. Not exactly. In Thanos Rising, these questions never stopped bothering the Mad Titan, even as he became renowned throughout the galaxy. In fact, he had child after child with woman after woman, and even became the captain of his own pirate crew. But none of it was enough. And here's the part of Thanos Rising that I love the most. This time, his obsession with Mistress Death takes a very different form. Remember that girl I told you to take note of? It's actually not even confirmed if she's real or not. She simply appears to him in the form of an unnamed girl who has been with Thanos since he was a child, constantly fueling his darker impulses. And despite how he had been with countless women, Thanos only truly loved this unnamed twisted girl. And in classic Thanos fashion, he would do anything, kill anything for her love, even his own children and the women he had been with. The scariest part is that no one but Thanos seems to see her. On a freshly destroyed planet, a lone survivor asks him why he keeps doing this, and Thanos replies that it's for her, for death. This is their conversation. And this man doesn't find anyone there at all. In the end of issue number 4, Thanos finally realizes that there isn't anyone there, and we get one of the coolest panels ever. In the end of Thanos Rising, he raises Titan to the ground and faces the truth. That there is no death. That he is thoroughly insane, and even more so, that he has always been completely alone. It's actually one of my favorite modern day Thanos runs, even if it gives the character a lot more of a tragic backstory than before. But it also deals with it in a way that's really similar to Starlin's work, in my opinion. At the end of Thanos Rising, Thanos has to confront the truth that he is simply a madman and that any quest that he's been on to find the answers to his existence was simply an excuse. Of course, that's only one interpretation of the comic, and you're welcome to give your own too. In fact, I would love to hear something different. Donnie Cates' Thanos sees him once again becoming a power-hungry villain bent on ruling the universe. In 2017, Cates gave us the Thanos Wins storyline, and it had a really interesting premise. What happens if Thanos actually succeeds? In this run, a present-day Thanos is dragged millions of years into the future to the absolute end of time. There he meets King Thanos, an older bearded version of himself who has systematically slaughtered every living thing in the universe. He killed the Avengers, he killed the Celestials, and he even killed Galactus. He is sitting on a throne made of their skulls in a completely dead universe. As for the why of it all, if you made it to this point in the video, you can probably guess impressing death. The difference between Cates' Thanos, though, despite having the same core motivation, is that he doesn't have the scheming and intelligence that let Thanos overcome every force in the universe in Infinity Gauntlet, or the introspection that he did in Thanos Rising. Instead, he's a bloodthirsty tyrant looking for a new challenge, something he can no longer find. Until he finds a Ghost Rider from the future, and naturally, his first instinct is to try to murder him. Like I said, this is a very violent Thanos. Now, flash forward to when they go millions of years into the future. Thanos confronts his own self, but he isn't happy at what he sees. In fact, the dude is in sheer disbelief. He cannot accept what he sees in front of him, an old, beaten down man who is still simping for death. The defining trait of this version of Thanos is that he literally bows to no one, not even himself. Both versions of Thanos actively threaten each other with death. He makes a show of all that he's conquered, which reminds me the Hulk is still alive millions of years later, but he's, well, see for yourself. Now, in Eternals, Gillen actually explored something other writers didn't, Thanos' family tree. All this time, Thanos was portrayed as this freak anomaly, a deviation in an otherwise family of perfect and peace-loving beings. Gillen flipped the narrative by introducing Uranos the Undying, great uncle to the Mad Titan who had been locked up for millennia because he believed the only way to achieve perfect peace was a step ahead of what King Thanos had accomplished, killing every living being that ever drew breath. This run basically follows Thanos as he goes up against the Eternals themselves in an attempt to become the Prime Eternal by hijacking the Great Machine, which is basically just a machine that keeps resurrecting Eternals every time they die, but is very intricately linked to their existence. Now, personally, I liked the freak anomaly angle more, because with Gillen's run, it feels a bit like his psychopathy and drive for control is inherited, which I think takes away from the character. Thanos is always who he is because that horrid, vile path is what he chooses. That is something that stays consistent in every writer's interpretation, and it's there in Gillen's too. I just don't like the implication that some piece of that choice may come from his great uncle. Here, the characterization is a little similar to Cates' version. He describes himself as a poet of annihilation, for one. And if that's not convincing, how about the narrator describing him as a creature of passion and murder? Thanos doesn't just brute force his way to victory here. He manipulates eternal politics, murders his rivals, and successfully becomes the Prime Eternal. Gillen gave us Thanos as a ruthless, immortal politician. It's also where he kills his mother for a third time, like again and again since she keeps resurrecting. And these are the key writers that have shaped the Mad Titan. Now, if you've made it to the very end of this video, firstly, thanks. I really appreciate you. Second of all, you might be noticing that there are vastly different interpretations of who and what Thanos is. But you might also notice that there are some core traits that do not change, regardless of who is writing him. When writing Thanos, the character is almost as alive as the writer himself, and one of those core traits is his ego. Every single writer agrees that Thanos' ego is his most defining trait. There are instances, like in Thanos Rising, where he admits that he is a monster. There are instances where he admits he is empty at heart, like in Infinity Gauntlet, but Thanos never surrenders his ego. At the end of every massive conquest, every cosmic battle, and every evil act, there is a person who believes he gets to do these things simply because he can. Another core element of the glue that holds the Mad Titan together is his supreme cold intellect. He is actually the smartest guy in the room, something even Adam Warlock acknowledged when he gave him the Reality Stone. Speaking of Adam, he even admitted that Thanos is the one who gives the heroes the means to defeat him, despite his cunning intellect. But as much as he is defined by these massive endeavors, Thanos is also defined by the motivations behind them. He is fundamentally a man who is alone, always and utterly alone. Starlin and Aaron heavily emphasize the impact his past had on this, his mutation, and his childhood as an outcast. Thanos, at the end of the day, throughout his history, has been someone who runs away from the emptiness within his own self by consuming and conquering everything else. And whether he usurps eternity, kills everyone in the galaxy, wipes out half of all life, or makes a lover for himself, he is never satisfied. Because Thanos, more than anything, is a lesson that until you accept what's in you, even the universe might not be enough. This was genuinely a lot to go through, but Thanos is such a deeply rich character with so much history that I felt like it wasn't enough to simply take you through a boring summary of his life. Like, yeah, sure, he killed people in 10 billion different ways. We know that. He's psychotic. He fears nothing. He is obsessed with death. The sky is blue. I wanted to take you guys through a viewing of the person beneath the Titan, and I know there are probably many more runs, authors, and writers that I left out, but I hope I was able to do that. And I hope that after this video, you leave knowing Thanos a little bit better, his isolation, his fears, and the things that make him Thanos. This has been Stick Vengers, and if you made it to this point, I, once again, thank you.